I spent years doing everything for one man, cleaning his office, balancing his books, driving his conference schedule, and working night shifts so he could sleep through the mornings. But the day he handed me divorce papers and smiled at the woman who had been filing his charts for 6 months, something inside me finally settled. I had always thought kindness was armor. For a long time, I believed my endless labor, my quiet presence, my patience, those were the pillars that would hold our family together. The reality was harsher. My kindness had been mistaken for weakness. My name is Sarah, and I am 56 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to the nights I slept at my desk and the mornings I kissed his forehead. Back to the little betrayals that looked like everyday life. I met Michael when we were both fresh-faced and hungry for a life bigger than the one our small towns had promised. He spoke about medicine like it was a calling, long nights, long texts, and a dream that felt noble. I believed him. I worked 2 jobs to keep our young household afloat while he studied. I remember those years as a blur of fluorescent light. Hospital cafeterias, accounting ledgers, cheap coffee at 3 in the morning. I paid his student loans, co-signed on the small office lease, and I learned medical billing out of necessity so the practice could survive. When his residency ended, he opened his private practice with more hope than capital. I became the accountant, the receptionist when we were too short-staffed, the one who scheduled patients and ordered supplies, who scrubbed the waiting room couch at 6 a.m. I wrote the checks, balanced the payroll, negotiated with vendors, and once, when a nurse quit unexpectedly, I sat at the front desk for a whole quarter just to keep patients from waiting and the schedules from collapsing. You think in sacrifice you'll be noticed? You think the person you love will wake up and say, "I couldn't have done this without you." But those acknowledgments never came the way I imagined. Instead, my efforts became invisible because they were reliable. Michael praised the work in public with a casual, "Good job." But in the quiet places, the bed, the kitchen, my years of giving became background noise. He forgot anniversaries. He called my spreadsheets helpful but boring and joked about my nagging in front of colleagues. Little dismissals became the daily weather. I convinced myself that family comes first. I told myself that building a life together meant we both poured into the foundation. I told myself that the late nights and the empty social calendar were investments in a future where comfort would come. I baked his pot roast for celebrations he barely remembered. I ironed his white coats. I refused to let resentment show because I believed resentment would cost more than it gained. There were moments, tiny and pointed, when I felt something shift. The way he laughed a little too long at a young intern's jokes. The way he started staying late for additional charts that coincided with someone's shift at the front desk. I swallowed those pangs, rationalized them away, and doubled down. If someone came between us, I told myself, we'd repair it. We were a team after all. Except teams don't sign away half the playbook without asking the teammate who kept the clock. I kept a ledger that still sits in my top drawer, dog-eared, with notes in the margins, dates I paid off a loan, nights I missed the PTA recital because the practice's bookkeeping needed reconciling. The year I took a job at the clinic across town so our sons could have soccer shoes. That ledger is not just numbers. It's the autobiography of a woman whose life was spent being indispensable and unthanked. And yet, each morning I put on my pearls, walked into the office, and greeted the world as if everything was as it should be. The first time I saw Emily at the front desk, I thought she was a temporary hire. 24, bright-lipped with a phone permanently lodged between shoulder and ear, she had the kind of fearless, modern grin I associated with young people who hadn't yet learned discretion. She filed charts with a flourish that looked rehearsed, and she laughed at jokes I should have found annoying. I offered her tips, how to handle angry patients, how to log payments correctly, and she smiled like she was taking notes for a future she planned without me. When Michael brought her to dinner at our home for the first time, she wore a dress that belonged in a glossy magazine and said things that made him look at her the way people look at sunrise. He called me later that week and said, "She's a quick study. We might create a new administrative system. I think this could be good for the practice." I remember thinking, How generous of him to make room and include me in future plans until the plan no longer included me. The dismissal first arrived as a paper. He slid the envelope across the kitchen counter like it was a menu he'd picked up at lunch. His eyes were steady. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," he said, and for a moment I thought he meant the practice's administrative burdens or the commute. He meant us. "You know," he told me, "I've met someone, Emily. We're in love. I'm in love, and it's something I can't ignore." His voice had a practiced gentleness I recognized, the kind he used when he wanted me to comply quietly. "Is this a sudden thing?" I asked, because I needed the honest geometry of it. He shrugged, as if shrugging could reduce belief to insignificance. "She was there when I needed her. She understands the schedule. It just made sense." I remember the words of Emily ringing in the doorway later, when she came with him to collect a box of his books from the study. "We're not hurting anyone," she said, soft as if the concept of hurting was for older women who complicated simple things. "Michael deserves to be happy. You can find your own life, Sarah." She said it with that dangerous conviction young people have, certain that the world will rearrange to fit their wants. When the papers were served, divorce, a quiet formality to get to the wedding, he tried to package it as compassion. "This is better for both of us," he said. "You can keep the house. I'll take the practice." He looked at me like he expected gratitude. "Thank you, Michael, for telling me," I said. I folded the papers, signed where expected, and handed them back without scene or protest. I resigned as chief accountant and manager the same week. The resignation letter was clean, professional, and utterly final, the legal version of the quiet I had been practicing for years. He tried to be cruel with a smile. "You always did the behind-the-scenes stuff. You'll be fine. Maybe you'll enjoy some freedom." Emily circled the practice like a new plant being watered with other people's effort. Her laugh became the soundtrack of meetings she barely understood. She made decisions based on what looked pretty on Instagram, hiring a PR consultant, changing the practice's website layout, ordering expensive linens for the reception area. "You did this to yourself," she once said, when I stopped by to collect a box of photographs. "You were indispensable. You could have demanded more." Her arrogance had the chill of someone who has never had to return a favor or balance a checkbook. Michael was worse on the phone. "I want you out of the financials," he said, as if he were instructing me to stop paying for a subscription. "We need fresh eyes. Emily and I are starting something new. Don't make this difficult." I could have screamed. I could have called a lawyer and waged a battle that would have bled into the neighborhood papers. But there was something in that moment that had shifted irrevocably. My life, all those sacrifices, did not entitle him to my presence or my labor. I had been living in a loop of self-erasure, and I stepped off. I walked out quietly, and that silence became the first breath of freedom. I stood in the doorway of the practice one last time. The waiting room smelled like lemon disinfectant and stale magazines. There was a blotchy photograph on the wall of our family at a holiday party. Someone had clipped a corner with a paperweight. That photograph had been there for years, a mute witness to everything I'd held steady. I took it down, folded it slowly, and placed it in the box with my ledger. My hands shook the way they always did when I was about to do the right thing, but feared the cost. I put a small succulent on top of the ledger and thought, this will live where I live now, not where I used to serve. I had planned a long list of details, closing accounts in my management name, removing electronic access, turning in keys. It was less about revenge and more about boundaries. I locked the file cabinet with a soft click and pushed the door closed. In the months that followed, I felt like a widow at the start of something unnamed. Tears would come in the random hours. At the grocery store, when I put a jar of my favorite apricot preserves in the cart. At the sound of a baritone voice that reminded me of hospital pagers. At the empty chair across from mine at the dinner table. But alongside the grief came a cool thread of clarity. I had been a river who had defined herself by what she carried for others. Now the current had slowed, and the bank of my life was visible. I resigned officially, writing, "After 28 years of service, I tender my resignation as chief accountant and practice manager effective immediately." I mailed it with a stamp and kept the receipt. The act of formalizing my exit felt like closing a ledger that had been left open for decades. I blocked Michael's number the night I left the key on the receptionist's desk and walked to my car without a backward glance. Nobody called me and asked me to come back for a farewell. There were no long embraces. There was only Emily's perfumed laughter and a new squeak of an office chair in a corner where my desk had been. I felt the pull of habit, calls that had always been mine to answer, invoices that would go unpaid, insurance premiums that would be late, but I had already weighed those costs in my chest and decided I would not be the emergency plan anymore. Financially, I was not destitute. I had prudently set aside money over the years, small, stubborn savings in an account I rarely touched. I used it to pay my rent on a small condo, to buy a used sedan that hummed when I started it, and to enroll in a short course that would allow me to package my experience into a new service. I called it modestly Practice Management Consulting. I had the expertise. I had the credibility. The world needs someone who knows how small practices survive, and I had lived that manual. I did not cut them off maliciously. I did not snatch petty revenge. I simply stopped being their supply line. I stopped authorizing payments for the practice. I closed the payroll accounts where my signature existed, and I stopped offering advice over coffee. When Michael's staff called me in a panic and asked for guidance, I suggested a professional firm, quietly and without judgment. It felt strange at first, this withholding of labor that had once defined me. But with every unreturned plea, my resolve strengthened. In place of the chaos I had been used to, I began to stitch a new life. My mornings were mine again. I walked in the park, planted herbs on my windowsill, and spent time with a woman a few floors down who loved to paint. I met a few kind clients who valued my experience. They arrived as anxious practice owners with tangled books and left with spreadsheets I had straightened and schedules I had redesigned. There was dignity in the meticulous way I created order out of disorder, and that dignity felt like warmth under a winter coat. I did not shout my triumph. I sent out a small, tasteful announcement: Sarah Blake, Boutique Practice Consultancy, personalized bookkeeping and practice management for small medical offices. A few days later, a message arrived from an old neighbor. "Saw your ad. Proud of you." That single note held more affirmation than any 20 years of being taken for granted. When Michael first called during this season, I let the call go to voicemail. His message was short, clipped with shame. "Sarah, come back. We need you. Emily messed up the payroll. There's an audit. I'm sorry. You have to help." I listened to it twice, then deleted it. The urge to rescue him was like an old ache, automatic and reflexive, but I had learned to wait before I answered. This time, the waiting taught me that my presence should not be the mop for other people's fires. Within 8 weeks of my departure, the practice that had been a quiet, if imperfect machine became a theater of chaos. Emily's desire for modern everything translated into a cascade of poor financial decisions that were as flashy as they were flawed. She had decided that a brand refresh required a celebratory launch party where she charged vendor expenses to the practice as community outreach. She hired a young social media manager and classified the payments as marketing research. When workers were hired as contractors but paid like W-2 employees, the payroll records didn't match. When vendors invoiced months late, no one followed up. The IRS does not care about romantic reasoning. They care about receipts and filing dates. The practice missed payroll tax deposits for 2 consecutive quarters. Loans that had been renegotiated under my steady hand were restructured on an assumption of a revenue spike from a marketing campaign that never materialized. The bank notices began arriving. The lights didn't flicker yet, but the silence of mismanaged cash began to take shape. The first letter I heard about was the certified envelope Michael received that autumn. He called from a number I hadn't blocked. He begged, his voice a raw thread. They've sent a notice, an audit. They say there are massive discrepancies in payroll taxes. I'm so sorry, Sarah. We didn't know how to. His sentences fell apart like a human who had mistaken the size of the ocean for a bath. Emily's reaction was theatrical. She accused others, then finally accused herself in a way that sounded less like guilt and more like desperation. I tried to do everything right, she told the practice staff during an emergency meeting, her mascara gone. I just followed what looked good. Her voice echoed in a room that had for decades been organized by my hand. It was the sound of a ship finally hitting rocks it had avoided for years, only because someone knew the tides. They made calls to me, to former staff, to vendors. They called the woman who once cleaned the carpets. They called the accountant who had once been my mentor. Nothing bridged the gap my absence had exposed. The firm that did the audit found misclassified income, missing payroll tax deposits, and evidence that personal expense lines had been mixed with business ones. There were penalties, fines, and the catastrophic recognition that malpractice insurance premiums could spike beyond what the practice could afford to pay without a large infusion of cash. Word spread slowly but inevitably. Patients began receiving confusing statements. The receptionist's attempt at charm couldn't fix overdue notice after overdue notice. A line of creditors materialized like frost. One day, the phone at the practice rang with a cold, professional voice. We are calling to inform you that your account is in default. Unless payment is made within 14 days, legal action will commence. It was as if the act of refusing to be their safety net had unleashed a ledger the size of an avalanche. That was when Michael came to my doorstep. He stood with his collar unbuttoned, hair thin from worry, and the expression of a man who had been fully inhabiting a life he had not prepared for. He rang the bell the way a man rings when he knows the answer at the other side will be the final arbitration. Sarah, he said when I opened the door, I need you. Please, you have to help fix the books. They'll have my license if we don't straighten this out. They can't audit a practice that isn't responsive. He reached for my hand, the way he had 10 years earlier when our mortgage was in jeopardy. I felt the familiarity of the gesture, and for a moment, years of habit tried to pull me forward. But the ledger in my head had a new column now, cost of enabling, and I would no longer be the sink for his mistakes. I can't, Michael, I told him. I said it softly, because there was no need for volume. I left the practice, I resigned. Those decisions were legal and final. Please, he said, I'll pay you. Name your price. The price he named in that room wasn't a number. He didn't understand that the currency I had accepted for so long wasn't dollars, but dignity. It isn't about money, I answered. You had a choice. You chose to hand everything to someone who didn't understand what she was handling. He dropped his head, and the words he dropped after were a litany of all the small ways he'd underestimated what we built together. I begged you back then, didn't I? I told you it would be different. I promised. I remember, I said. And I remember deciding to keep giving regardless. That decision is the only thing I can undo, but I can decide what I do next. For all his fear and the audit letters stacked on my kitchen table as evidence of impending doom, he tried one more angle, the pleading, the humiliation that had been his late-night specialty. I don't know how to do this without you. You know the forms, the people. You can fix it. My voice was quiet and precise. Fixing it for you would be repairing the bridge you burned. I will not do that. And as he left, I watched a man who had built a life on borrowed labor realize that currency can turn on you. The calls continued. He called voicemail code for desperation. He texted, then he left messages with friends we used to share, asking them to speak to me. None of it shifted the boundary I had set. Nature, like balance, has a way of restoring itself. The practice's doors stayed open for a while longer, but doctors left. Patients found practices where staff were stable. Vendors tightened terms. Emily, who had thought love and trendiness could hold an operation together, left town within 6 months. Rumors said the wedding was postponed, then canceled, then moved across town. Michael lost a sizable portion of his savings trying to paper over the problems. The legal fees were a slow leak. I received a text one night that was nothing but an image, a foreclosure notice for the practice's bank loan, stamped and dated. The caption said simply, "We messed up." Karma, if you want to call it that, was not something I orchestrated. It was the natural arithmetic of incompetence when unanchored by care. They came back crawling in ways that were both ugly and pathetic. Michael first called at dawn, his voice raw with shame. The message he left was almost a child's plea. "Please, Sarah, I have nothing left. They put liens on the property. The partners are suing. I'm sorry, I made the worst mistake of my life. Forgive me. Please, forgive me." Emily's message was shorter, brittle. "I didn't mean for any of this. I just wanted more. I'm so sorry." She attached a photo of herself at an airport, sporting sunglasses and a tired smile. I listened to both messages once and then erased them like a protective incantation. I had people around me, friends who helped me set up the consultant business, a neighbor who offered calming courage, a client who needed help with a frazzled schedule and who reminded me why I had left. I could have been the repair person. Instead, I was the witness to a lesson they had to learn themselves. They sent letters that arrived with overly formal apologies. "If you would consider returning temporarily to help us through this crisis, we would compensate you handsomely," one read. Another was less formal. "We made the worst choices. We are sorry. Come back." I sat with those letters on my kitchen table and drank tea while the late afternoon light sketched long, forgiving shadows across the page. My life had given me a curriculum of grief and repair. I had paid for years of other people's negligence with my time and body. I had a new business to grow, a new rhythm to protect. There was a man who had wronged me using regret as currency, and I had to decide if that currency was legal tender for my continued life. When Michael finally came to my door a second time, he was a hollow man. He could barely meet my eyes. He muttered apologies that had been rehearsed for the last 6 months. His ego had been replaced by a man who realized his life had been propped up by another's labor and that the scaffolding had been removed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I am so, so sorry. Please." I held up my hand. It was a gesture he had never seen me use before. "No," I said. "No, Michael. I will not rebuild what you chose to destroy. I will not be your emergency response team. I've said this before." His face went through every color of humiliation. "But the license is not mine," I said. "Your choices made that your problem. I will not save you from the consequences of your decisions." The way I said it was without fury, which made it more devastating. There was no drama, no public shaming, no theatrical calling out. Just a calm, irrevocable refusal that landed harder than any scream. It was dignity dressed as silence. Emily called once, and I answered long enough to say, "I hope you learn. I hope you take responsibility." She sobbed on the phone, then muttered that she would. I hung up. That was the end of my involvement. I could have fed their humiliation to the world like a feast. I could have told every neighbor and former patient the story in a way that would have reduced them to parable. But cruelty breeds its own hunger. I had no interest in adding venom to the wound. My revenge was quieter. It was the steady rebuilding of my life without them in it. My consultancy grew the way a small garden does when tended daily. I took on one practice at a time, usually clinics with less than 5 doctors who needed someone who had been there for decades. I taught staff how to classify payroll properly, how to separate personal and business expenses, how to prepare for audits before they begin. I taught kindness at the ledger and discipline with invoices. People trusted me because I had lived the problem and had crafted solutions out of real-world messes. One afternoon, I sat at a small seaside cafe with a lavender tea and a notebook full of client notes. The ocean beyond the window moved with a patient rhythm, and gulls argued over a crab somewhere beyond the pier. I had never imagined a scene of such quiet equilibrium years earlier when nights were measured by pagers and patient charts. I breathed in the salt air and my chest felt lighter. A woman at the next table commented on the color of my scarf. "That's a brave color for winter," she said. I smiled. Sometimes brave is just choosing what makes you feel good. That gentle moment felt like a benediction. I had been brave in small ways, closing accounts, blocking numbers, signing resignation letters, but bravery in the everyday was the thing that changed my life. It allowed me to reclaim hours, friendships, and purpose. It allowed me to be seen again. I do not romanticize what happened. I still work. I still feel sorrow when I think of the years that could have been mutual. But there is a comfort in the knowledge that you don't have to be everything for someone who refused to be loyal in return. If there's one lesson I want to leave with you, it is this: presence is a gift. You have the right to spend it where it is cherished. You are not obligated to be the safety net for people who choose convenience over commitment. The quiet refusal is a powerful instrument of change. You do not have to make a scene to make a point. Firm love for yourself and the dignity of saying no will sometimes be enough to let natural consequences do the rest. I still keep that little ledger in my top drawer, but now it is a record of the life I am deliberately building. I teach others how to protect what they create. I sit on my balcony with hot tea and a small cat named Henry, and sometimes I watch the sun tilt its face into the horizon. There is peace in routine, and there is a fierce joy in waking up without having to rescue a life that was never yours to save. If you are watching this because you are sitting at your own kitchen table with a stack of papers and an ache in your heart, I see you. There is a future where your hands are not always the ones to clean up the mess. There is a future where your kindness is returned, where your labor is respected, and where you are free to say, without apology, "I will not be responsible for other people's ruin." My revenge was small and ordinary. It was not dramatic. It was a boundary tied firmly and lovingly to my own life. And in the end, the most devastating thing I did to them was to keep living well.